She was not a soldier or fighter. She was just a kind of a girl from a country small town.
Joan of Arc, formerly known as Jeanne d'Arc, was born on January 6, 1412 in Domremy-la-Pucelle, France. She was born into a peasant family consisting of her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romé, her three older brothers, Pierre, Jean, and Jacquemin, and her sister, Catherine. Her family was very religious and went to a chapel called Notre Dame de Vermont, which still exists until today. Her pious mother instilled in her a deep love for the Catholic Church, and with a strong spiritual foundation, Joan faithfully abided by her beliefs. During that time, females were forced to stay at home and learn how to take care of their family. They were not given a chance to have a proper education, nor were they given a chance to have full lives. Consequently, Joan grew up as an illiterate woman, unable to read nor write properly. But this never seemed like a big deal, because as a woman, you were born simply to take care of your family.
Women in the Mediterranean lands in the south have legal rights than in the north, even peasants. Noble women fare better than peasant women. Women in the 12th century did better than in the 15th century. Jeanne d'Arc came from a rural setting. She came from a farmer's or a peasant family. She would not have been treated very well.
At the age of 12, Joan began to experience visions where verbal communication occurred, as well as the appearance of visible figures of saints and angels which she could see and touch, including Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, and Gabriel. She was convinced that these voices were sent by God to give her a mission of overwhelming importance, which was to save France by expelling its enemies and to install Charles as its rightful king.
I don't think that very many people make those kinds of claims, but what bravery that gave her. You know, she believed she was being told directly by God to do something, and she did have insights that surprised people, and they believed too that she was being led by God in some way. And, I think the women saints that you might study, many of them found their strength in believing that God had called them.
As part of this divine mission, Joan took a vow of chastity, which is when one pledges to stay a virgin for the rest of their life.
She believes in giving herself completely over to being pious, being devoted to her God, and that gives her her strength and her courage.
During this time, the 100 Years' War was taking place, where a conflict occurred between France and England. The English had taken over more than half of France, and Orleans was about to fall to the English rule. The British invasion of France during this time of war prevented King Charles VII from being coronated and ruling over the country. With this determination to save France, Joan went on to get legal permission. Joan arrived in Vaucouleurs, a nearby stronghold of those loyal to Charles VII in February 1429, hoping to get a military escort, and this was when her military career began. At first, her request was rejected by the local magistrate, Robert de Baudricourt, but she didn't give up. She found him again in the marketplace and gathered a small crowd. She then made a speech about God's plan for her and claimed that she was the one destined to save France. Knowing that she didn't have much of an education as a young child, it would be expected that the speech she gave wouldn't have been impactful towards the crowd. By contrast, her speech managed to convince the crowd, and Baudricourt eventually relented. Joan was able to present persuading speeches even with a lack of education, and this showed a sign of a great leader early on in her life. Joan then chopped her hair and dressed in men's clothes before going on the 11-day journey to visit Charles at Chinon. Upon her arrival, Joan requested him to give her an army to lead in order to protect Orleans.
And there she was, 16, 17 years old, coming up to the person who should be the King of France and telling him she was going to make him king.
If he agreed to this request, she promised him the throne of France. Charles granted her request despite the doubts his counselors and generals had. In March of 1429, Joan set off for Orleans dressed in white armor, riding on a white horse. White armor was a type of armor worn in the medieval period that was highly polished, and when viewed, it looked almost white. When Joan wore her armor, the effect was probably dazzling, giving her an almost ethereal glow that further strengthened her reputation as a saint sent by God to lead the army. On May 4, 1429, Joan stood outside Orleans awaiting the arrival of other French troops. Suddenly, she had a vision to attack the English immediately. At the same time, there was already an attack in progress. French troops were attacking one of the English forts, and once Joan arrived, the French rallied to her dynamic presence and took the fort. It was a decisive victory for Joan and seemed to justify her strange behavior as divinely guided. As can be seen, Joan was a religious and charismatic leader, one to have inspired young women to go beyond what is expected of them, and not to be discouraged by the stereotypical standards set by their community. When more than 100 of her troops were wounded, Joan courageously stood up to them and said, "Be fearless, and you will raise the siege." This was a prime example when Joan showed to be a charismatic leader. According to Professor Teofilo Ruiz, Joan was able to rise to such a high position of power after coming from a peasant family because in the Middle Ages, in spite of great changes in mentality, there was still a deep belief in sainthood and religion. Moreover, the French were doing so badly against the English and the Burgundians that Jeanne d'Arc appeared really to be sent by God. She was the catalyst for a revival of France. Before Joan's victory at the Siege of Orleans, Charles VII was not able to be the King of France, even though he was rightly entitled to be so. This was because Reims, the city in which all French kings were coronated in, was under the control of the English. Joan of Arc's calling was to bring back Orleans to the French possession. This allowed her to escort Charles VII through enemy territories, claiming towns that resisted along the way, and Charles was coronated as King Charles VII in July 1429, just as Joan had promised him. Joan wanted more than anything else to have God's will and plan for her to be done, and that is to free France from the English. In May 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, also known as the East Germanic tribe, and imprisoned at Beaurevoir. A while later, she was sold to the English for 10,000 francs. She was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the English. During the trials, she was kept in chains and threatened, but she kept a positive attitude through the whole trial. She eventually confessed and was sentenced to life in prison.
What she continuously does is putting her judges against God. She sees herself as the mouthpiece of God. And because of that, she comes over as strong.
But the English turned her over to civil authorities and she was sent to be burnt. Her death was one of the greatest injustices during the Middle Ages. Joan died at a young age of 19 when she was burned at stake, not once, but twice. After 25 years of her death, she was proven innocent by the Pope. Nevertheless, Joan left a huge legacy, not only in France, but the rest of the world. She has become a symbol of French resistance to occupation. Her figure and her cross were used during World War II to give hope to the French. She also symbolizes the manner in which even low-born and weak people can do heroic deeds. A leader, a hero, an inspiration. That was Joan of Arc, and her leadership led to legacies that will forever be remembered by people all over the world. She once said, "One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it. But to sacrifice what you are and to live without belief, that is a fate more terrible than dying."